Let me introduce our speaker, even though I'm the first one to talk, and then we'll continue. Bill Baer is an emeritus faculty member of the school, and for many years focused on housing issues. And he is trained traditionally as what's called a houser, right, Bill? Usually those are the people, in fact, who did the kind of work you described in your paper, right? Catherine Bauer Worcester and all those people are the people who did it. They're in some sense your forebears.
She was my advisor at UC Berkeley.
All right. Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Then I touched the hand that touched the hand. Anyway. And Bill went to emeritus, what, about 5 years ago?
Yeah.
And has never been more productive and happy in his life. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's true.
He's become much more concerned about matters historical, but whether he's writing about London real estate markets in what, the 18th century? 17th century, sorry. Or about American policy, what he's demonstrated in his work, and it's been really quite remarkable, is how much you can learn from history, but only if you're not just a historian, but you know a lot about housing or whatever. Because historians have no analytic framework. Is that a fair way of putting it? But thinking about housing, they may be economists, but that doesn't tell them how to think about housing or real estate development. So it's a really testimony. I think of Bill's work as testimony to the importance of knowing something about the world, as well as being, having analytic categories. And he's done a lot of archival work. How often do you get to London, by the way?
A couple of times. But the Huntington is fantastic. This is the next best place, Southern California, UCLA, USC, Huntington, for research on London.
It doesn't rain. All right. Anyway, Bill was here when I came, and I'm glad he's still here. Let me summarize very briefly Bill's paper, and then say a few comments about it. What Bill is saying is that at a certain point, we set a national goal of 26 million housing units over the next 10 years. Any realistic estimate of the cost and resources required would have been shocking. And so either was not made or was not discussed. But the problem is, two things happened that were very important. One was a change of administration. And though at the time, the change from Johnson to Nixon was thought to be dramatic, in retrospect, it was much more, to my mind, much more continuous, though others might argue. Because in fact, Nixon was still a social policy type. Maybe a different social policy, but very much committed. He had Daniel Patrick Moynihan in-house. It was not either first Bush or a second Bush administration, nor a Reagan administration. Anyway, so that was one big change. So the question is, you make a goal under one administration, you change it, and what happens? But the other important thing is, what happened was a change in culture, from a concern about housing to income. Bill's explanation is that people's housing, minimal housing in general, improved so much, so that the question of substandard housing was there, but not so dominant as it was in the past. And second of all, there arose essentially what we see now, the rise of markets and income as a substitute for talking about social policy. The idea was give people more money, give them various incentives, rather than telling them what to do. Is that a fair summary? And so he's trying to say what we can learn from such an experience, and second of all, trying to suggest as well that knowledge may well be very useful nowadays, especially when we're talking about global warming, where we're going to set goals, Kyoto-type protocols and so forth. I have a number of comments that I'd like to make. Some of them, and most of them are not so much critical as side remarks. Frankly, I'm not an expert on the history, so I couldn't say, oh, he got this wrong. I thought it was quite wonderful, because I learned a lot that I didn't know. And more importantly, I'll get to the point, that knowing a lot makes a big difference in understanding what happens. The first thing is that observation is statistics, which comes from the word for state, is in relation to policy and government. You don't gather statistics or information unless they serve or don't serve governmental interests. because it costs a lot of money, it costs organizational resources. And so, for example, the question of what kind of housing needs to be and what's the supply, or what's the supply levels, or what's the status, changed dramatically because you had different levels of information. At one point you gathered very little, then at a point you gathered more, then you stopped gathering it for other reasons, and so forth. All right. By the way, if anybody ever says the reason they stopped gathering information is to save money, you know that it's an excuse for something else. All right? It means either they don't want the information done or something like that. So one of the deep issues here is essentially the fact that statistics, information, and policy are intimately connected. A second lesson is that the level of historical detail about who voted for what and why makes an enormous contribution. It's not that so much it's hidden as so much it's not attended to. Is that a fair statement, Bill? In other words, it's none of this is sort of like finding some, though in fact we do find some things in the archives. But in fact, when we think about policy, often we don't spend as much time on legislative history and on legislative intent as we might. Though I imagine there are a lot of people who do. The third thing is, which is a bit more critical of this, is when you ask why are laws passed. Bill's argument is there's guys who passed these laws, they must have meant what they said, look what happened, all right? My sense is that the specifics are often less important than the sentiment or the general tone. In other words, the specifics, which may or may not be well vetted, even having a congressional budget office doesn't mean that Congress listens to them. Or what is it, the office of, who does research, Congressional Research Service and so forth?
Congressional Research Service, something like that. They do have a separate arm.
Yeah, but again, one observation about legislators is that they are selective in their need for more information. Is that a nice way of putting it, I think? Because they have other purposes. And I think one of the things that this paper makes me realize is how often what people state in legislative intent or in actually the language of the language is often what I would call emotional or emotive or expression of general interest, rather than they mean 26 million housing units. The 26 million came from something deliberate, but maybe you can correct me. One of the things that Bill talks about is that this kind of work is a form of national planning. I can understand when people talk about goals, but my notion of national planning is somewhat different. Whether I'm thinking in terms of planned economies, which often are quite stories of central planning and decentralized corruption and mismanagement and misinformation in general. The more rigid the central planning, the more corruption there is below to make the people feel good, but nothing happens. That was one of the problems in the Soviet Union for a long time. Or you could have French indicative planning, or you could have planning based on market forces where you develop incentives and so forth. My impression about this is that this is not a very good example of national planning, in that I don't think there was ever the bureaucratic infrastructure or intention to organize it. But you can disagree with me. But I don't see that. In any case, it's nothing, people always talk about socialism or, the government taking over. One's impression is this is not, that. I mean, probably the biggest form of housing planning was FHA, VA mortgages, and things of that sort, plus the interest rate deduction, right? If you want to choose that. My feeling is that the turn to income policy and more generally the markets has now come to the current meltdown. Not simple causal, but interesting. In other words, what's happened at that time, where we shifted to income policy, where we talked that way, eventually led to the idea that what counted in some sense was those fiduciary measures, those pecuniary measures. And the instruments in some sense, the institutions and so forth were, instrumental to that. And my feeling is that, in fact, one of the reasons we got in trouble of late is because, in fact, people were always thinking in terms of those incentives and so forth, rather than norms of behavior. In that sense, the turn in about 1969 to income maintenance, from lots of other things, for the poor becomes income maintenance for the rich, in effect, through incentive systems. And I'm quite willing to believe they have something to do with what's going on now. The last point I think that I want to make is that you have to try things out to find out if they work. In other words, you may have a crazy idea, like going to the moon, but it might happen. You might have a crazy idea of 26 million housing units. It might not happen. But it may turn out that one of the functions of government is to, or any entrepreneurial endeavor, is to try things out and see how far you can go. And if they don't work, you like to turn around and fix it, though that's very hard to do in a legislative structure, or in fact in any corporate bureaucracy, because there are so many people who have interest in the current form. That's why you have to not only fire Rick Wagner, but probably force the whole firm into bankruptcy. I want to close with a more general comment. I loved reading this paper, and the reason I loved it is because I learned so much, even if I disagreed with some of its assumptions. Because it gave me a much richer texture for understanding what happened in the last 40 years. And it's that texture which informs, in some sense, Bill is, I would say, I wouldn't call him an optimist. How about that, Bill? All right? I'm not sure I'd call him a pragmatist even. But he's acutely aware of the human foibles in all of his work, though he's a quite generous man otherwise. And I think that what makes this very interesting is just how things sort of lost their way. Bill, would you like to make some comments before we start some question and answers?
Thank you for inviting me, Martin.
Well, thank you for coming.
One of my papers is speculative building underappreciated in urban history. Was a result of the seminar. I was one of your early participants. And what I've been sort of doing is applying my understanding of housing and housing markets to earlier periods of time, because historians are relatively uninterested in how housing works. They take it for granted, not particularly interested. And I stumbled into the fact that 17th century London, which was a boom time for London, was also the rise of the speculative builder. The speculative builder has been with us, I say, back since Roman times. And I don't know about other countries. I think it would be wonderful to investigate whether that's true as well. So I've been trying to sort of, I'm not an historian. I'm sort of tone deaf on some items that are of interest to them. I don't get it, or I have to be reminded, pointed out. But I'm trying to fill niches pertaining to housing that they sort of pass over, or they don't know how to look at the data that's in front of them and put it together. I've also, and this comes to a remark that Martin made about legislative intent and the like, I found as a planner that I would grasp at any old bit of information if it would help me make some kind of projection into the future. And then time erodes everything, bypasses the period or eats up the period that you were talking about. No one remembers whether planners were right or wrong with respect to their projections, and they're off doing still more projections. So I found that I was rather careless, non-questioning of my data sources. And historians are very good at that. They don't trust anything that they first encounter. And I still have this foible, oh, that's a good piece of data, I can manipulate that to make some projections. And they're very, very suspicious. On the other hand, they're extraordinarily timid. They're unwilling to take much in the way of a chance in making an approximation, for fear if it's wrong, what's the point of saying anything at all? And I think making successive approximations are a fine way to proceed in history. I can't say that that's greeted with enthusiasm. And this article on speculative development as being a major component of how Western cities have developed since the earliest time, is met with a dull thud. No one cares. It disrupts what they're interested in. But let me get back to what Martin said about legislative intent. That's a good criticism. I am using the words that I find on paper as perhaps a crutch. And maybe I'm too quick to seize upon, oh, well, there's a nice rationale, I can work with that, rather than looking at a deeper level. In many ways, I subscribe to the notion that politics is largely symbolic, and what politicians say is not necessarily what they mean. And so I'm going to go back and think about that, Martin, see if I can find some other sources to sort of test that concern, because maybe I took the easy way out. As to what is national planning, one book by an historian who purports to talk about national planning in the U.S. said, well, I'm not going to define it, I will let my book reveal to you what it is. Well, he was dodging a tough issue, because the book never does really reveal what planning is. I think I was stretching to make a point. In the U.S., that's about as close to planning as we've often gotten. It's not the traditional planning approach that you invoke from the top down. But we've learned in I read another book on national planning in which the guy just summarized various schools of thought about urban planning and said these are great ideas about planning. So I don't think much work has been done there, and I'm sort of ducking the issue too. I don't know how to say what it really is, and maybe I just mean that for the United States it was rather venturesome, because it did mean marshaling capital and somewhat men and materials. Since I've written this, I've done some further research on congressional hearings. At this very time, some committee, I forget which, held hearings on the nation's lumber supply. The Japanese were beginning to buy up a lot of our sources and turn it into plywood and the like. And it turned out if the nation was going to meet this goal, the U.S. Forest Service, or forests, would have to be opened up at a higher rate of cutting than had been done. I think there's going to be an environmental angle there, because that idea of cutting more forests drives a number of environmentalists nuts. So I want to explore that issue, but national planning, I don't know. I think you have the prime example in your mind. Russia is the most obvious. The socialist countries didn't, I don't think, plan quite so heavily. So I think there are degrees of it, but maybe I need to be more specific about trying to separate those things out. Any other points? Oh, yeah, this originally started out, or the version is a history article. So I do have quite a bit more history, but my sense of social scientists just aren't going to take the time to wade through all those pages that historians are able to do. I don't know how they do it. They don't have as much content per page as social science does, but they sure read a lot. I marvel at when they rattle off various books about a particular topic, rather than just various articles that I was interested in. So I'm partway through this. I was intrigued about, as I mentioned on the front, about the environment. I see more environmental goals coming down the road, and I see people of necessity being simplistic in embracing some of those goals. And I would think, just like a housing market, really it's sort of absurd to get a national total and start from the top and work your way down. It's much smarter to build it up at the local community or market level and then see what the aggregate comes to, because all cities are not the same. And my guess about the environment, about air quality, say, is that we're going to need measures of all the different various airsheds that we have in the United States and accumulate them up to some national level. Then it makes no sense to just give a blanket figure, that there's probably different background levels and different airsheds. I know nothing about the environment. But I can just see us making the same kind of simplistic assumption about here's how we cure a looming problem. And in many ways, I think you have to make those mistakes or you don't really know if you understand the phenomena very well. Ecologists think they know a lot about the environment, but I get the feeling that when they do a substitute and they take out a certain amount of, what do you call it? An area that has an ecology that has to be made way for housing subdivision, and oh, we'll build another one over here. We'll put in a pond and we'll do some other thing. As I understand it, those are not going very well. They're not nearly as rich and as fertile as what was taken out, but how can a scientist know only in a laboratory what they really know? You've got to get out and try to recapitulate it or reproduce it. And only then do you really understand what it is that you're dealing with. So I'm pessimistic that our initial environmental efforts won't turn out so well, but I think we have to do that. We can't just do paper exercises.
Is it all good? You want to say anything else? Or?
No, I
is that an
just
expression
say it in my paper.
Huh?
What little I know, I put in my paper.
No. I think, by the way, just to comment on your comments on my comment, is that I think the question of legislative intent and national planning, in some sense, are secondary issues to the real issues you're talking about. So you probably can write your way out of the problems, unless you don't want to. Right?
I could spoil part of the story.
Yes. All right, fine. Shut up, Krieger. Keep swimming. Anyway, I'd like to open it up now to questions from the people in the room.
I just have an observation. Sorry I got here late. I missed Martin's remarks. I read your paper, though.
Well, that's an improvement over most of our faculty.
I was over in Capillion at another meeting. The thing that struck me the most was this one, this small little thing that you mentioned about the Kerner Commission and the 10-year housing goal that was established right before the change of administration. So Nixon comes in and he's supposed to follow through on the plan. I never thought of that before. That's not going to work very well. You can't have a plan that's going to go across multiple administrations. They don't really take it to heart. So that was an interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an important. Maybe I should emphasize that a little bit more. Is that's not how we think about our political parties. That they're going, well, I guess that's not true. The Republicans accepted Social Security.
Yeah.
Only for a while, not anymore.
Well, Bush wanted to supplement.
For a long time, though, they did. On the environmental thing, Bill, there's I don't know if you know the article by Thomas Marson, like 1973. I have it in my files. And he's from the Forest Service, and he was doing a projection about future housing needs. And the purpose was so they could plant enough trees. They had to have a 30-year projection so that it took that long to grow the lumber. And so they were trying to figure out, will we have enough trees for all these houses? And so there's an example there where they were watching it.
Yeah, I'd like to get that. That would be very relevant.
Yeah. It's a pretty short article. I don't remember where it was published, but I have a copy of it.
Concerning the legislative intent and enforcing future presidents and future bureaucracies that actually implement it, there's some really interesting literature in economics that just does this as a principal agent model, where the kind of question they ask is, why would any legislature pass anything if they know that they're going to, who's the people who are going to implement it, they have no control over? So the question is, how do you actually restrict the future actions of legislatures? And one of the really, and some of them that they say, one is that they put in some type of fire alarms, and so that they set up citizen groups or the public interest groups and give them some power. So the main example I always remember about this is that under the Environmental Quality Act, the environmental interest groups were given the power to sue states and the federal government for their inability to implement the intent of the law. Well, this created the environmental movement because now all of a sudden all these lawyers could support themselves by getting the lawyers' fees after successful lawsuits. And that was that. So there really are some examples of this type of legislative efforts to ensure that future administrations will have to listen to that.
I find that very interesting because, as I mentioned, William Proxmire tried to resuscitate the thing and keep it going, and he held elaborate hearings, and all kinds of housing-related people showed up and said, here's what we've just seen is not the way to do it, but here is how it should be done. And I haven't fully researched it, but it just seemed to have died in committee. And so I think having to go outside Congress and invoke a different branch to enforce it through the courts, that's a very interesting.
And my other comment is that the interesting thing about talking, I'll just wear like pretend that I went to Chicago and got a PhD in economics, is why in the world would we have planning for housing? Housing's a private good, people buy it, that's exactly what markets should be able to do, relieving the government the necessity of planning in that area. And I think that in when I read through your history, one of the things that I kept on thinking is that, well, actually it does seem like the market solved a lot of the problems going this. I always remember when I used census data, I think that they finally for the 2000 census they eliminated it, but the 1990 census they were asking people whether they had indoor toilets or not still. And that appeared to me completely anachronistic. But it was only anachronistic because we had been so incredibly successful in those 70 years between 1930 and 2000 of getting people proper plumbing. In a way, you can, the way I see what the progress of this, in one way is this, so the progress of looking at housing as a production of a private good problem to an income problem is moving from what markets do well, produce things that reacting to market demand, to things that markets do less well, and that's distribute income amongst all the stakeholders in the country. And the other aspect I think that you would hear from if Richard Green and those people were here is housing also involves a lot of externalities, like environmental issues, and that's the way. So the questions of crowding, whether you allow housing to be built, how dense you allow the housing to be built, whether the housing is situated near industry, and so on. All those core planning issues really become a big aspect of whether we get housing built or not. So the way I think that in LA, the big debate right now for housing is one of the big debates, at least, is inclusionary zoning, which is all about how much housing we're going to have where, which is fundamentally a planning issue. But it's not really about housing production. It's about what are the rules for how we situate different land uses next to each other.
Well, historically, remember in the 30s and even before, socialism was held in much higher regard by many people. Mm-hmm. The private market had these ups and downs in housing and in so many other things that you really couldn't, the thinking was, you couldn't depend upon it. And we need government to produce housing because we will do it right. And that sort of sold itself in parts of Europe. The Scandinavian countries were fairly successful with that. The public housing, which was the first sort of U.S. effort to do that, was so watered down and so tied up in knots that even were it a good idea, it couldn't and the U.S. restrictions couldn't succeed. But that notion that government had to do it is what we've been fighting over, I think, for most of the 20th century. And I don't sense in all this crisis of people wanting government to get too much in. They're still said, well, we're just going to take over the industry for a while. We're going to go through bankruptcy with GM, but then, we're going to step back. So I think it was partly a mindset of, oh, you have to have government do it. And we've been weaned away from that idea. Whether we'll come back to it in light of the market getting too exuberant, I don't think so. I think we're more sophisticated now than we were back at the turn of the century. The housing reformers were incredibly naive as to how the system worked. And they woefully underestimated how expensive housing is as a government policy. My quick reading around the world, governments have gotten into housing and they've backed off. It's too expensive. They've got defense, they've got health, they've got other things that they want to do. And so they just don't pursue vigor. Even the communist nations backed off after, or did it via the factories and like. But it's just incredibly expensive to build housing.
But the reason people got involved with housing is because of the truly ill-housed.
Yeah.
Right? The thing we don't realize now, that we see it some places, but how, 30% or whatever, they're famous 1/3 of the country. Well, probably in 1900 it was 1/3 of the country was ill-housed, maybe more. And that has enormous political implications. You can talk about distributional, but the fact of the matter is that it was believed, and probably it was true, that it was, I should say, it delegitimated your government when you had that many people, especially in urban places, where you could see it. And so I think they were not informed. That's my idea. You said they were naive. I don't think they cared. I think they saw this as a social problem, that it would cost a lot. I have no idea what they knew. You know more than I do. But that wasn't what informed it. What informed it was a sense of social, in early Protestantism.
Well, they thought there was a lot of fat in the housing market that government would drive out.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, they thought big, huge speculative profits and the like. They didn't understand how it worked. Now, today, we've got a lot of government action in the market through regulation. That's why it's an income problem. We pass laws about you have to live in this quality house that many people can't afford given the income distribution.
But
And
you
so,
can,
we've just shifted the nature of what the problem is.
you passed those laws because when people lived in the housing they could afford, we found that morally unacceptable, at least some did. Now, that may be a mistake.
But public health was pointed to back then, but that's largely been discredited. That housing doesn't make a lot of impact. There are more important things going on in your life than the physical space.
Did they know that then?
No. It seemed so evident. So many people were, in bad health that happened to live in the slums, but maybe they couldn't have access to medical care. Maybe it was a poor diet. It could be any number of things.
But Marty, let me respond to your word, your moral word. You said how it was not acceptable for people to live in the kind of housing they could afford. Well, what happened was that they raised the standard to a very high level. A moral level would have been one where you get people off the street, get them, where they don't have a dirt floor anymore, where they have plumbing, at least access to plumbing. But they raised the standard so that it was an egalitarian standard. It said everybody should have equal access to middle-class housing. Now, I don't know whether that's a moral statement or not.
No, that's different.
Well, but it is a moral statement.
Yes.
It said we should all be middle class, and there should be you should not be providing housing that is a lower standard than you would have middle class people live in.
Right.
That's decent homes for the living environment. That's the goal. Well, that's pretty extreme. That's very expensive. We could have said we want people to not have dirt floors anymore. We want people to have a roof over their head that doesn't leak too much. But we didn't say that.
Well, the interesting analogy comes up in college education. One of our colleagues circulated something about, you saw that thing. But the basic thing is, if you go to USC or any one of these places that charge you, what is tuition here now for undergraduate? 30 a year or more?
More.
Right. If you go to one of these joints, you're going to a country club. You know, it has health services, it has, it has a lot of things in it. It's a very, and so you have the competition from the University of Phoenix and a whole bunch of other places. And so you could ask, what would be a good version of college education, right? Now, partially community colleges do some of this, right, at much lower cost. Though not really, I don't suspect it's much lower. I think it's just your tuition is lower. But you could ask that same question, all right? And so it's a very interesting question about, for example, the environment stuff. Lots of people would be better off having dirtier air and more cookies or more, you know what I mean? If everybody's trying to keep them alive till they're 100 and their problem is they're going to be hit by a truck or, get up, or something else, right? And so it's I think this, Bill and you are making a very deep statement about how rational we are about our standards and regulations. And, yes?
Well, I want to take it one step further by asking Bill back on the history with the Kerner Commission, or Kerner Committee. The committee?
Kerner Commission.
Kerner Commission, Kaiser Committee. So they were inspired by the urban riots. And because of the urban riots, they wanted to build 10 million housing units. And I think, as I recall right, your numbers were 800,000 of which would be low income. Right, so less than 10% would be low income. So is this a proper diagnosis of what the problem was? There was a urban riot. Was it a riot over housing? Were housing conditions in any way part of the cause of the riot? And are they in any way a solution to the causes for the riots? But somehow, what's the connection there?
That's a good question, Mel. I'll look into that some more. It's clearly sort of a physical determinism going through people's mind. I mean, I don't go down and drive through Watts, but 40 years ago, that was okay housing, nothing great, but it was okay, but that's where the first riot broke out. But people they associate, we have these riots, look at the housing they live in. They don't see their paycheck, they don't see their bank account if they have one. Housing is a very visible manifestation of poverty. And I think society gets embarrassed by it. I don't think they really want to cure it because they like the fact that middle class is superior. But they're embarrassed to have it sort of evident for all to see. And so I hadn't really, there was a simple-minded, we'll cure the housing problem and then they'll be model citizens and happy. And that's not the way the world works.
Or it was just a knee-jerk reaction, which I've seen recently with homelessness. Repeatedly, just the word homelessness implies it's a housing problem. Well, it's not really a housing problem. There's like 3 different problems. But nonetheless, they want to do something about homelessness, and so they do housing. And so there was an urban riot, and they want to do something. And so they just reached out and grabbed this housing production goal as being a solution. Then they got model cities after that. You got more sophisticated. I always teach in my planning theory class, it's a learning process. We go through stages, and you learn. And you make all these mistakes, and you shouldn't make the same mistakes again. And we're learning as we go along.
I'm going to try to track that down, reread the reports. I first started this in an article in 1984. And really got into it, got it rejected by the Journal of Policy History. I guess I got my feelings hurt, and so I went off and did something else. I don't really remember what I was doing. I've done a counterpart to this that came out in the Planning Journal on local housing studies.
Or Metropolitan. Metropolitan.
Yeah.
Because your article was on metropolitan housing, wasn't it? Metropolitan planning?
Well, I just talked about different kinds of housing studies and how they evolved, and sort of fair share housing in California was sort of the top of that. But yeah, it is sort of a knee-jerk 30s reaction, I think. Cure the housing and cure the people. And we won't be vexed by all these unsightly disturbances.
I have a question about that. How certain is the evidence that that this goal came directly from the riots? I understand it happened after the riots, but is this a cumulative effect of?
Well, a number of the commissions, 3 of them, came to similar conclusions. We've
Right.
got to do something about housing. And the Kaiser Committee, which was the last, and finished its work shortly before Johnson had to get out of office, they got to be the most specific. The others were more vague. The Kerner Commission was sort of out to lunch. They just, we can do whatever we want. Weren't very realistic. But they did point out that despite all of this talk of aid going into housing, damn few low-income people got served. It was the middle class, as so many programs do serve them.
Because it just seems like it really, that's not what the riots were about. I mean, I've been reading about the 60s riots because I'm writing an article with Lisa Schweitzer on riots and as a form of place claiming. We're arguing that it's really about lack of access to mainstream political avenues. That people rioted because they had that very localized control over trying to express the frustration that they didn't have it at other levels because of it.
Citizen participation.
Right. So a lot of the stuff that I've been reading has been very critical of these commission reports and the things that were happening at the time, that they completely missed the ball because they were reading it from this very upper middle class perspective on things. And it wasn't about housing, because the people who tended to riot were actually better off than the other people who were living. I mean, they were definitely, these were mostly in ghettos that were.
They had higher expectations.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and they had more to gain from actual.
That's what the French Revolution, it was the riot of the middle class, not people.
Right. So that's why the disconnect between it being about housing and what was really going on, it doesn't make sense. But I agree that the reaction about, well, let's build the housing is very 30s, because it didn't work the first time. They didn't get what they wanted, and trying to push the government to do it, it wasn't working.
And another way of putting this is that we've had, the last 20 years has been a push about, own your own home. Is it 20 years? Do you know, Donald?
Longer than that.
But, especially of late,
1931.
Yeah, but I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it, sort of home ownership.
Oh, under Bush.
Yeah,
And
that's what.
Clinton.
Huh?
Clinton first pushed it.
Yeah, 1995, I think.
All right. Well, you know more precisely. But the push about home ownership, in some ways, reflects that whole idea. I mean, in other words, it's an idea of a different version of, through your home, your house, you will become a better person or a citizen or whatever, right? It's authentic. It's sort of going back to was it Locke with property and citizenship, and that whole idea of it, and that's really interesting. In other words, that even the right wing, the left wing, they all still share an idea about that. That the solution to your problems lies in this your square footage and its adequacy.
No, the act of ownership, then you have a stake in society, then you won't burn it down, is sort of the simplistic reasoning.
Yeah. But it's a long history of this. It doesn't go away even if, I say, the myth, you say, well, housing, it's other things that go on, access, but doesn't seem to matter. That knowledge doesn't stop people from thinking that maybe they'd be better off renting, financially, for various reasons. But that's not it. So I think your point that you've all been making about housing, your point too, is really very deep. Yes?
I was just wondering, in the same line, when you look at low interest rates and the subsidy that the federal government provides the homeowner, how does that fit in with this kind of national housing goal? That's also kind of promoting home ownership, promoting housing
Well,
production.
I've done some research on that. I wrote my dissertation about the income tax thing. It was all a mistake, an accident. The interest rate deductions got written in back in 1916 when the income tax was declared constitutional. You should, by rights, declare the imputed income that you get in the way of rent, and then you deduct your interest and your property taxes from that additional income, or have it all merged together. But Congress didn't understand business very well back then, and they were grasping for a tax solution. The tax only hit the upper class. Most people didn't get taxed in the income tax when it first passed. It wasn't until World War II that the nation made it a mass tax and did the withholding. Really reached down to lower levels. So it's only after the fact been trumpeted as a housing policy. It just happened. Oh, and then some other things. It didn't make any difference for a long time, but after the war, Second World War, housing prices started rising, interest rates started going up, property taxes started going up, and so it began to have an effect, that deduction. But that's part of the problem with our whole system. If we give these huge benefits to the wealthy through the income tax deduction, there's no way we can afford to catch the poor up, because we're giving bigger benefits to the wealthy. And there's been some talk about let's cut some of those tax benefits after $250,000, and politicians are reacting to their wealthy constituencies or lobbyists. They're not interested in going there yet. I think you have to start there, or you'll never get a housing policy to help the poor. As we keep being able to allow the rich to afford better housing standards, then our whole nation's expectation rises up, and that involves greater expense. I don't mean to take up all this time. It's just,
You're wonderful.
I don't get the lecture rule anymore.
You're not lecturing, you're informing.
You're entitled to hog the floor.
Well, it's more than that. With hogs like this, they're all, they're a silk purse, so to speak. Some more questions from other people?
Yeah, where do you think we're going from here? You kind of talked about how housing can be framed in different ways. It was framed as a housing problem versus an income problem. I've been interested during this housing crisis how there's been framing versus the ignorant homeowner who was duped by the banks versus the savvy speculator who duped the banks, and having very, very significant ramifications for the policies that would roll out from those two different framings of what people in trouble with mortgages are. Where do we go? Especially, we're going to see the percentage of Americans who own their homes decrease rapidly over the next couple of years. Do you foresee that that housing being framed as a government responsibility again?
Well, I'm as surprised as anyone about the events. It's not like I saw it coming. And my guess is that there's some bright people at the PhD level who are going to come up 10 years, 20 years from now with the answers of what went wrong right now. But my generation isn't going to figure them out. I'm stuck in the past. I don't know. Clearly there's going to be a number of changes. I don't think the nation intellectually has absorbed the depth of this problem or what we might do in response other than to throw money at it. And I'm not, first I I was for that. Now I think if both the Bush administration and the Obama administration knew back in September what we know now about how serious things, would they have done what they did? I don't know.
I think homeownership has gotten, some of the bloom has gone off it because of the fact that it's not such a good investment. It's probably not so bad, but it's not good. And from what the literature I read, it's a depreciating investment in general, over the long term. So I think that's one thing that will go away, at least for a generation. Like in my parents' generation who lived through the Depression, where it wasn't so obvious that owning a home was a necessary thing. Because a lot of people got burned, a lot of people know people who got burned, and so they start, when they buy houses, presumably they're going to buy houses for their current value, not for their long-term appreciation. And that makes house prices much less attractive, right? Because you're not buying an investment. And insofar as housing no longer becomes, your main source of the future, which it was getting that myth about it, right?
Yeah, my sense was that the nation didn't start having housing prices as a cocktail topic until the early 60s. And before then, prices just didn't do very much.
And I don't think it was really a cocktail topic into the 80s.
Yeah.
Because I remember when I came to California and I realized that that's all they talked about. In Boston, they were talking about it in Boston too, but, by 82, 83, but before that,
Yeah.
this was not the biggest issue. I could have bought a house in Minneapolis for $14,000, a nice house, in 1976. Maybe, because Ford had a special deal, $2,000 off or something.
That's a big percent.
Huh?
That's a big percent.
You bet your boots. I didn't think, but who thought about buying houses? Are there other questions? Because I'd like other thoughts, because this is really important stuff.
Well, just on the Chris's allegation that, well, no, Bill's allegation, one of you, but no, it's Chris's, but homeownership rates are going to really go down a lot. How much do people think are going to go down?
They'll stop around 60%. We're about 67, or we're 67.
69 was the peak.
Was it?
And it was around 63 or 66 5 years ago.
5 years ago?
Yeah, longer ago than that.
66.
Some nations have higher than the U.S. We are not the nation of homeowners.
Oh, come on. China, major cities in China have 80% homeownership rates. The statistics don't really exist. That seems to be generally acknowledged. So this communist country has many more capitalist features than the United States.
So Bill, did you say 60% or 62%?
6-0, I'm gonna guess.
Okay, I'm gonna go 6-2. Any other bets? Come on.
Oh, I don't even think it'll go down that low, because I think that
that's
whatever the home ownership rate was in 2000 it has not changed very much. It has gone up very little.
Right.
It's gone up from like
Steady.
by 61 to 64% in the last 20 years. If housing prices go.
They went up 2 percentage points in the 1990s. That was the first time it changed in 20 years.
And then in the 2000s, it went up.
And then I think it went up 4% more. I'm not so sure though. So you're right, it might go down very much, except I think it's going to discourage young people from buying houses for a while.
Yeah, that's.
And that'll depress the rate more.
My 24-year-old next door neighbor is just about to buy a house.
Really?
And but this has completely changed. 3 years ago, and he's been living with his mother for the last 5 years since he graduated from college. So to him, this housing crisis is the greatest thing ever.
So she is buying him a house to get.
He has been able, through 5 years of rent-free life, he's been able to save up this money.
I think what we know, it would be interesting to know what shocks do to people's consumption behavior, right?
True, yeah, no,
And I don't know what that is, but people must know something about that. Presumably it goes down for a while, and the question is, when did it start recovering, right? You know, we know that if you raise the price of gasoline, things go down for a while, but they recover to a large extent. Housing is a much larger unit. I don't know, but that's the issue, right?
Right, I think, you know, people do generally, the things completely broke down during the height of the bubble, but generally, people are highly motivated by just comparison. How much would it cost to buy a house versus how much it would cost them to rent? And there's all these problems and assumptions of, you know, future changes in rent versus the future changes in the housing prices. And all these people got duped into thinking that buying an expensive house was a good idea because they had these completely unsupportable assumptions about how much it was going to increase in value in the future. But the things that I find most encouraging is you read in the newspaper now that people are buying houses and they're saying, yeah, this, of course I'm going to buy a house right now because I can save a couple $100s off of my rent from doing that. That didn't exist. That didn't exist, and that's, you know, that's what the economists would say is the long-run equilibrium between the housing and the rental markets.
Well, yeah, you also have to take into account the cost of the down payment. They're thinking financially, pecuniarily rather than financially. And I suspect if you take in the cost, the interest that their down payments would pay, it's probably not so different. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the down payments, I'm not so familiar with this, but I think the whole concept of down payments has really has changed radically lately, where it used to be 20%, and now there's lots of people still buying them with 3 to 5%.
not now.
Not now?
So I think they went the other direction. Now they're being conservative again.
Okay.
It did go down to 3%, but now it's back up probably to 20. They actually have a sliding scale. The mortgage rates shift depending on how much you put down. I'm refinancing at 40%. I can get a bigger rate.
A better rate.
Yeah, a good rate. And they won't tell me what the schedule of rates is, but I know I'm getting a better one. It appears than anything that's advertised.
I think that there is some interesting behavior trends coming out right now that people that have at least 5% equity in their home will not walk away from their home even when they're further upside down in their mortgage than they should be. So they should walk away from where they are from their house and rent, because it doesn't make any sense the money they're pouring into a mortgage that's lost 50% of its value, but they're staying in those homes anyways. So there's some I think there's some interesting policy implications in what down payment should be, and that there is a level. We went way too far one way, but that we also have some emotional attachment, some behavioral decisions we're making. And then at the same time, in terms of the rental thing, there's also evidence now that people are make sort of irrational choices about renting and buying still, even when they look at their monthly payment now and they forget variable costs, which is a large part of owning a home. And we still don't talk about those variable costs, even now, when we're talking about.
You mean unforeseen maintenance problems?
Right, which you don't have as a renter.
Yeah, I know.
And that's the cost of it when you look at the lifetime of being a renter or a homeowner. I think it's going to be interesting to see how we come up with policies to respond to those things, and because we are sort of starting to understand behavioral choices with home ownership a little better.
But it's a cultural thing, and I think that's the problem, that a lot of the analysis that's strictly about money that way. I mean, for decades now, the government's been telling you to be a full citizen, you should own a home. And we don't really capture that when you say, oh.
Yeah, but I think the point of Bill's whole paper is about that housing, as you say, symbolically does certain kinds of things. And therefore it functions in a very different way than a durable good with consumption value, right?
There's that, but the regulatory climate, what's required to build a house is constantly going up. We haven't made that link in our mind as far as building codes and the like, and that's what's going to start pushing house value back up again. Is you can't build the new ones cheap.
And if it gets greener, it'll get worse.
I think it's going to get worse. There's more environmental regulations and better seismic safety and.
But then the decreased cost of the time, the initial cost maybe.
Well, let me say two things. One, affordability was not an issue back in the 50s and earlier. Didn't exist. Few people had affordable housing. There was a lot of crummy houses out there that you could rent. Now it's the most important concern because the physical quality is so much better because of the regulations. And sort of we had some other point I was going to make.
We haven't had any success with the inside subsidies either, right? Like the Section 8 vouchers aren't really solving the problem either. I mean, those are just as disastrous, and we still have
What do you mean?
a fundamental.
They solve the problem.
How, I mean, there's all kinds of people with Section 8 vouchers that they can't use. They don't work, I mean, they can't find an apartment at the level of the section. I mean, it doesn't, the market's still not, we're still not, I just don't, I mean, for instance, in Chicago, I was highly involved in public housing in Chicago, and they tore down all the high-rise public housing and gave everyone Section 8 vouchers. And then the plan was that's how people were they were gonna vote with their feet, figured out what we go market on this. And then people ended up piling into their friends' apartments in the same neighborhoods, ending up with the slum conditions that we were originally trying to get rid of. And because the Section 8 vouchers were useless, there was nowhere for people to use their Section 8 vouchers. Landlords didn't want them because there's still not enough rental housing because we still have a stock problem. I mean, there's still a supply side problem. I mean, I think that we still have but there's still a mismatch.
Yeah, well, it varies by market. You need to have enough vacancies to make that work.
Right.
That demand side won't work if there's no vacancies.
Well, we've moved, I think in lots of ways, we've moved towards demand side, like subsidies working as a rule better than supply side because we've had really negative experiences with housing. But it doesn't seem to, and at the same time, you're right, we've made, land has become more scarce and we've made regulations
The other point,
tighter.
I don't remember reading about the homeless until what, the 80s or 90s?
After 81. It's been all Reagan.
I've never, and I thought, oh, it's just, the lousy U.S. system, but then you read it's happened all over Western Europe.
Well, in New York, we had something called bag ladies, shopping bag ladies. And they were there in the 60s. And they would sit overnight under the stairwell or out of the subway.
No, but that's to do with the deinstitutionalization.
Well, this is in the 60s, though.
Right, that's where it happened.
Well, they didn't talk. These bag ladies were, they weren't.
They were depressed rather than schizophrenic?
I don't know what they were. But that was in New York, but you didn't see it everywhere else. And then in the 80s, it was, again, deinstitutionalization under Reagan. That
They
triggered
didn't
Reagan.
talk about that in the 30s.
They had hobos. They were hobos. Yeah, and there were people who were riding the rails looking for work. The story is that my wife's grandfather was doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think what's most interesting about today's discussion, and I think it's important, Bill, is that though we have a real estate program, the kinds of issues that you're talking about, while they would be interested, are not the central ones there, because they're dominated by real estate finance. And the housing issues are very differently phrased in terms of the intellectual foundations and so forth. I mean, that's what Dowell is concerned about, right? Dowell, you're much more not a real estate, but a housing person.
Right.
And that really is different.
Yeah, real estate's one means to an end.
Right, but typically the way they study real estate tends to be,
It's the whole world.
huh? Well, no, it's just because of the finance orientation, because you can do quantitative stuff on it.
Yeah.
So I think it's very valuable to have someone, Bill, probably should come back again.
Sure, if I can think of something else to do. You don't want to know about 17th century London.
I do. I think that all of these kinds of historical stuff is wonderful.
Right now I'm working one on how did the suburbs get developed.
Right.
The story is, they just happened. There were the suburbs. They don't think about who were the investors. And it was sort of the middle class, apparently, that would invest in the suburbs. Not very good data. And then no one has a clue as to what percent were owners and renters. And so I'm trying to get at landlords and what kind of role they play in the burgeoning metropolis. It's just, I point out, it's almost as frequent as marriage. If you got about 50% of the people renters,
They never talk about it.
They just don't think about real estate. It's as cities grow and they all talk about that. But they don't
Actually,
think housing.
there was one of Greg Heiss wrote a book on industrialization and suburbia, which is apropos. And one of his students, sorry, name escaped me, did this thing on rental housing in Los Angeles, did a whole dissertation on it, which was very nice. All right, I want to thank you all for coming. I think it's the kind of intellectual discussion we'd love to have. I'm grateful for